Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking into the case of Joseph Kondro.
Right.
He's a child predator and murderer,
Yeah.
and his story is detailed really well in John Douglas's book, The Killer Across the Table.
Mm.
And we're going to be looking into his case today.
Yeah.
The thing that makes Kondro's case so disturbing is that he targeted his own friends' daughters.
Right.
He used that trust and closeness as a weapon.
Yes.
It really makes you think twice about who to trust, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Condra's case is a very stark reminder that evil doesn't always lurk in the shadows.
Right.
Sometimes it hides in plain sight, disguised as someone we think we can trust.
Absolutely. And Kondro was really good at that whole blending in thing. He was described as charming, persuasive, even likable. It's almost like those traits were his most dangerous weapons.
Absolutely. In the book, Douglas talks about how Kondra's ability to project an image of normalcy was key to his success as a predator. And it allowed him to operate under the radar and disarm anyone's suspicion, and ultimately gain access to his victims.
And that's what's so scary about this case. Because if a guy like Kondro, who was so good at playing the nice guy, was able to deceive so many people for so long,
Yeah.
how can we ever be sure who we can trust? It's a question that a lot of our listeners might be wondering right now.
And it's a really good question. But I think instead of letting fear kind of take over or paralyze us, we can let Kondra's case empower us to be more aware and to recognize signs that someone might not be who they seem.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
What were some of the early warning signs in Kondra's life that maybe, in hindsight, should have raised red flags? I mean, nobody's born a monster, right?
Right.
There have to be some hints along the way.
Right, you're right. There are always hints.
Yeah.
And in Kondra's case, the signs were definitely there, even from when he was really young. He had a history of lying and stealing, even from those close to him.
Wow.
And when he was caught, he showed absolutely no remorse. It was like he didn't understand or care about the concept of right and wrong.
So he had that classic lack of empathy even as a kid. That's definitely a huge red flag.
Exactly. And even beyond that, there were suspicions of child molestation during his teenage years.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, the charges were never filed, so those incidents were just swept under the rug.
So it's almost like he was practicing, honing his skills of deception and manipulation from a young age. That's scary.
What's fascinating from a behavioral standpoint is how these smaller offenses, they were often dismissed or overlooked, but actually laid the foundation for his later crimes.
Right.
They revealed this consistent pattern of disregard for others, a lack of empathy, and a disturbing ability to justify his actions. These are all classic signs of a budding sociopath.
And those tendencies, those dark impulses, really came to a head in the cases of Rima Traxler and Cara Rudd.
Precisely. Rima was just 8 years old when Kondro abducted and murdered her in 1985. The truly disturbing part is that Kondro was a close friend of Rima's mother. He even often babysat her and was seen as a trusted figure in her life. That trust, so tragically misplaced, is exactly what he exploited.
And then, over a decade later, he did it again. This time, his victim was 12-year-old Cara Rudd, another daughter of one of his close friends. It's like he was using friendship as a weapon.
And that's where Kondro's intelligence and his meticulous planning really come into play.
Right.
Douglas emphasizes that Kondro wasn't driven by some impulsive urges.
Okay.
He was very methodical, calculating, incredibly patient. He'd spend months, even years, embedding himself in these families,
Wow.
waiting for the right moment to strike.
Gosh.
It's a chilling example of predatory grooming, not just of the children, but of the mothers as well.
So it wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was very calculated. A carefully orchestrated plan to gain access to these vulnerable young girls. That level of premeditation is terrifying.
It is, and it highlights a crucial point that Douglas makes in his book. Predators like Kondro often target single mothers.
Because they're more likely to need support and welcome a helping hand.
Exactly. Kondro would present himself as this very helpful friend, someone these women could rely on. It disarmed any suspicion, right?
Right.
Because who would ever suspect a supportive friend of such horrific acts?
It's a horrifying thought.
Yeah.
And it really makes you realize these predators are masters at exploiting vulnerability. They can sense weakness and desperation, and they use it to their advantage.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And what makes Kondro's case even more disturbing is that throughout all of this, even after he was caught, he showed absolutely no remorse, not even a shred.
That's right. When confronted with his crimes, Kondro was cold and detached, almost as if he were talking about the weather. He even tried to shift the blame to the victims' families for not being careful enough.
Wow.
Can you imagine?
It's a classic sociopathic trait, that lack of empathy, the inability to comprehend the pain and suffering they inflict on others.
Yeah.
It raises this huge question that we'll go into a little bit later. If Kondro hadn't been caught, how many more victims would there have been?
That's scary.
Yeah.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
It is a really scary thought. And it really underscores why it's so important to understand how predators like Kondro operate.
Right.
It's not just about morbid curiosity.
Right.
It's about
Yeah.
equipping ourselves with the knowledge that could actually save lives.
Exactly.
If we can recognize the red flags, those subtle signs of danger, then maybe we can prevent some of these tragedies from happening.
Kondro's case is a huge wake-up call, a reminder that we just can't afford to be naive or complacent when it comes to the safety of our children.
So let's talk about those red flags. What are some specific behaviors that, parents or really anyone who interacts with children should be on the lookout for?
One thing that really stood out in Kondro's case was his mastery of manipulation. He was so good at figuring out how to push people's buttons, how to play on their emotions to get what he wanted. Like, he was really good at guilt trips. He would offer to help these single mothers, and then he would subtly imply that they weren't doing enough.
Wow.
It made them feel like they had to rely on him more and more.
So it's about recognizing those subtle power dynamics, those situations where somebody might be trying to have too much influence over somebody else,
Yeah.
especially a vulnerable individual.
Exactly. Another thing to look out for is a lack of respect for boundaries.
Okay.
Does this person keep pushing the limits even after you've asked them to stop?
Right.
Or do they try to isolate your child from you or other adults? These are big warning signs that should never be ignored.
It's like they're testing the waters, seeing how much they can get away with.
Right.
And a lot of times, these individuals are really good at explaining away their bad behavior or making excuses or even blaming other people.
You're exactly right. They might say things like, "Oh, I just love kids so much," or "You're being way too overprotective."
Right.
And it's a way of gaslighting you, making you doubt your own instincts.
It's so insidious because they turn your concerns against you,
Yeah.
making you feel like you're the one with the problem.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to trust your gut. If something feels off, even if you don't know why, don't ignore it.
Right.
It could be your intuition warning you about danger.
Yeah, that's such an important point. We need to teach ourselves and our kids to listen to those little alarm bells going off in our heads. But, it's important to remember that not every person who displays these behaviors is a predator, right?
Right.
We don't want to create this culture of paranoia where we're afraid of every single adult.
You raise a very important point.
Yeah.
It's all about striking that balance. Not everybody who's overly affectionate with children has ulterior motives. But it's important to be vigilant,
Okay.
especially in situations where there are these power imbalances or maybe vulnerabilities.
So how do we walk that tightrope? How do we teach our kids to be careful without making them afraid of every adult that they meet?
I think open and honest communication is key. Talk to your kids about body safety. Teach them about the difference between good touch and bad touch.
Right.
Empower them to speak up if someone is making them feel uncomfortable. Make sure that they know they can always come to you no matter what.
Yeah, and it's not just a one-time conversation. These conversations need to happen all the time,
Absolutely.
as our kids are growing and developing.
As their understanding of the world is evolving, the conversations about safety should evolve too. We have to adapt to their level of maturity.
One thing that I found very disturbing about Kondro's case was that he was deliberately going after single mothers. It's like he was really preying on their vulnerability, their need for help and support.
You've hit on a really key part of how Kondro operated. He was really good at figuring out what made people vulnerable and using that to his advantage.
Yeah.
Single mothers who are already juggling so much might have been more likely to accept help and companionship from Kondro.
And that's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
These women were really doing their best for their kids, and he used that against them.
Right.
It makes you wonder what we can do to better support single parents and protect kids.
It starts with creating a culture of support. Encourage open communication, offer help, and be vigilant without being too intrusive. If you're a good friend, a good neighbor, a good community member, it means looking out for each other. You have to be aware of potential risks
Right.
and be willing to take action when something seems off.
It really takes a village, doesn't it?
It does.
We all have to be responsible for protecting children, and that includes supporting the adults in their lives who are really trying their best.
You're absolutely right. Kondro's case reminds us that predators target people they think are vulnerable, maybe isolated.
This deep dive into Joseph Kondro's case has been really insightful, but also very unsettling.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that evil can be anywhere, and that we all have a role to play in protecting the vulnerable.
I completely agree. Kondro's story is a cautionary tale, but it's also a call to action. We can learn from his tactics, we can recognize the warning signs, and try to make the world safer for our children.
It's about empowering ourselves and our children with knowledge,
Yeah.
teaching them about safety and open communication, the importance of speaking up if something's wrong.
Absolutely. We can create a culture of awareness, support, and vigilance. And hopefully, in that kind of culture, predators will have a much harder time and victims will feel empowered.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up our look into the mind of Joseph Kondro, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned.
Okay.
We've talked about how chilling his crimes were, his tactics of manipulation, and how important it is to be able to spot red flags. But the one question that keeps coming back to me is, what drove Kondro to do what he did? What's going on in the mind of a predator like this? It's the question that seems to always come up. Why?
Yeah.
What could drive somebody to do something so horrific?
Yeah.
It's like we're trying to understand something that we just can't.
It is. And, we want a clear answer.
Right.
But the reality is that the motivations behind these types of evil acts are very complex. There's rarely just one reason.
So are we talking nature versus nurture here? Was Kondro born evil, or did something happen in his life that made him go down this road?
It's probably a combination of things.
Yeah.
Remember we were talking about his early life, about how he was always lying and stealing and felt no remorse. Those behaviors, even from a young age, could point to antisocial personality disorder or what we call sociopathy.
So you're saying there could have been something biological, something in his personality that made him more likely to do this type of thing?
It's definitely possible, but having a predisposition doesn't automatically make someone a killer. Think of it like this. Some people are more likely to get certain diseases, but that doesn't mean they will get sick.
Right.
It depends on a lot of factors, their environment and things like that.
So in his case, those early behavioral problems were almost like a warning sign, a vulnerability that was made worse by other things that happened.
Exactly. Think about those suspicions of child molestation when he was a teenager. We don't know for sure what happened, but if those were true, that early exposure to deviant behavior probably shaped him. It could have pushed him further down that path.
So it was like a perfect storm, a potential genetic predisposition and then negative things happening around him.
Right.
Wow.
And this is exactly what makes these cases so complex. We can't just point to one thing and be like, that's why he became a monster. It's usually a mix of things that make somebody do something so awful.
I understand that it's complicated, but I think a lot of people listening are still trying to understand the basic question. What makes a predator like Kondro tick?
Right.
What do they want? What's their goal?
In a lot of cases, especially with child predators, it comes down to wanting power and control.
Okay.
These individuals get a sense of satisfaction from being able to manipulate and exploit other people.
Right.
It's not always about sex, although that is often part of it. It's about domination, the feeling of having control over another human being.
So it's less about a physical desire and more about a deep psychological need. It makes it even more disturbing somehow.
Yeah, and that's exactly why it's so important to understand the psychology behind it.
Right.
It helps us to recognize the warning signs.
So let's think about Kondro again. What psychological traits stood out that could have led him to do what he did?
Douglas points to some very classic sociopathic traits, like a lack of empathy, completely ignoring social norms, but having superficial charm, being very manipulative, and having an inflated sense of self-worth. And there's also a history of deception.
But he was able to hide all those things for years.
Right.
He just presented himself as this harmless guy.
Yeah.
It's crazy how well he was able to fool everybody.
That's the thing about these types of people. They're masters of deception.
Yeah.
They can be super charming and likable, and that's what makes them so dangerous.
It all comes back to trusting your gut.
Yeah.
If something seems wrong, even if you can't say why, you've got to pay attention to that.
Yeah, I agree.
It could be your intuition trying to tell you something.
A lot of times we don't listen to our gut because we think it's irrational or we're just being paranoid. But a lot of the time, those feelings are trying to tell us something important. They're noticing little things, things that maybe we don't consciously see right away.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
I think the big question for everybody listening is, what can we do with this information? How can we apply what we've learned to our lives and stay safe and protect our loved ones?
The main takeaway is that predators can be anyone.
Right.
They can be charming, charismatic, they seem trustworthy, and they're in our social
Yeah,
circles.
it's hard to accept that.
It is.
It means that we can't just rely on how somebody looks or what
Yes.
we assume about them. We've got to be more careful, more vigilant. Watch for those little things that might give away their real intentions.
You have to remember those red flags.
Right.
Things that don't add up in their behavior. Violating boundaries, trying to manipulate. Don't be afraid to ask questions and challenge those assumptions. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is.
And it's not just about protecting ourselves, it's about teaching our kids,
Yes.
teaching them about body safety and being open with us and making sure that they feel comfortable coming to us if somebody makes them feel uncomfortable.
We can all help create a culture where people are more aware and more supportive and more vigilant. And hopefully, in a culture like that, predators will have a much harder time and potential victims will feel like they can come forward.
This deep dive into the world of Joseph Kondro has been tough,
It has.
but it's something that I think we all needed to hear. It makes us think about some really uncomfortable things about human nature and the fact that there are people out there who will do really bad things.
Yeah.
But we can also take away some tools and knowledge and feel more prepared to protect ourselves and the people we love.
Knowledge is power. If we know the tactics and motivations of predators like Chondro, we can take action and make the world a safer place for ourselves and for everybody else.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And to our listeners, stay vigilant, stay informed, and most importantly, trust your gut.